So the pre-Renaissance art can be broken down into Byzantine and Gothic art. Now the artwork is going to shift its attention to Christianity and step away from polytheism or even the everyday individual that we saw in the Hellenistic period. So what this does is it creates a new canon in a way. And we're going to see that sort of shift into the Renaissance at the end. So first, a little bit of backstory that goes all the way back to ancient Rome temporarily. Around the 300s, an emperor in ancient Rome known as Constantine the Great decides to declare Christianity acceptable. So before this sort of moment, Christians are basically murdered on site or worse, and that's why we actually have the catacombs in Europe from sort of Christians hiding out. So obviously people didn't just sort of change overnight, but as we see this sort of acceptance and this gradual shift, we see in arts, sculptures, and just works in general that they're rather ambiguous in meaning. So as a means to sort of protect the works, since if they weren't in the catacombs, they were basically destroyed, they took on multiple meanings. And we know this because of this piece in particular. It came from a home in Turkey that had other Christian works, and those works were sort of hidden, but this one was out in the open. So why? Why was this one out in the open? Because the symbol, the Good Shepherd, was originally for Mercury, the god of travel and messages, who was also, what we don't really recognize, is the god for shepherds. Mercury being the Roman name, Hermes is probably the more common Greek name. So going back to the actual sculpture itself, its body, we see a hint of contrapposto in the bent knee, but there's no foot forward. There's no authoritative or aggressive gesture in any way. In fact, he's in a rather relaxed, free pose. And what helps to allow such a stance is the fact that it is built with supports. So the body isn't one solid unit like we saw in the past. Instead, the arm is supported by the cane, the leg supported by the tree stump. So this is all to support the upper half of the body. And here we see another sarcophagus, which, if you remember from the Etruscans, this one is vastly different. Now, Junius Bassus was he was a higher authority within the Roman court, and he embraced the Christian iconography, even though it was still on shaky grounds. So, looking at the relief figures of the sarcophagus, we begin to see the sort of medieval art canon take root. On a side note, a relief sculpture is a carving not in the round. It's basically flat and one-sided. So it's kind of like, if you remember the Palette of Narmer, this one is a little bit different from the palette in the case of it's a high relief. So it's a little bit deeper. It's almost within the full round. So the figures in this high relief still shows contrapposto. There's overlapping, but what I really want to focus on is the head in relation to the rest of the body. It's disproportional in the fact that they're exaggerated and too large. For it to be accurate to real life, the body wouldn't be able to support that kind of head. So the body's in proportion creates this stubby-like aesthetic. Although this one is also functional in a way, we start to see a shift from function to decorative during this time. This is reminiscent of the ancient Asian works, if you remember, that were more decorative icons of worship. So too will the Christian medieval works take on that role. Now this is sort of a sarcophagus for this work. It tells the story. It has a couple of functions, believe it or not, even though I just said that they're going to be non-functional. This one in particular is a little bit reminiscent of earlier works because it has two functions. They tell the stories for the illiterate, and number two, obviously, this one again has a relationship with the body in the fact that it encompasses the body. It is a sarcophagus. So now something really interesting is, if you noticed in the Good Shepherd, and what you'll notice here, is that the depiction of Jesus is not, or I should say, in art, it's not yet taken on the canon in which we recognize today. This depiction in particular, he's very young and dressed in Roman clothing. His feet are actually over the head of a Roman god, and as an assertive, sort of risky move, stating Christianity's dominance over sort of the ancient gods and goddesses of the time. Now, this was a very bold move considering that it was 359 CE, and Rome doesn't become predominantly Christian until 400 CE. So not until roughly 40 years after this is when we see the infamous Holy Roman Empire. So now we enter the Holy Roman Empire. And one of the emperors of the time was that we're going to look at is Emperor Justinian. Now, he's interesting, he's significant to the Romans because during his time, a lot of tension in northern Italy was happening. There were barbarians that were trying to invade, Vikings were trying to invade, a lot of people were coming in and invading northern Italy. So Emperor Justinian sort of keeps them at bay, and in most cases, he actually wards them off. So during his rule, he erects a couple of Christian churches. And the one we're looking at right now is in San Vitale, and it's the mosaic of Emperor Justinian and his attendants. Here we see him partaking in the Mass, holding the bread, standing next to the bishop. He's even given a halo to show his sort of significance or importance. Now we see in this mosaic a canon of the Byzantine or medieval time, where the masses or lesser individuals are given the same exact face and body. Only those worthy will have distinctive features. They're just icons to represent or fill in for the story being told. So not only are they stripped of their individuality, but they are flattened, and the only cue we are given that there is depth is that they are overlapping from one another. And in fact, at their feet, they have a sense of depth, or they don't have any sense of depth, I should say, or accuracy. The only sense of depth that we do see is seeing the feet overlap. And again, that's to sort of reiterate the hierarchy that they're trying to portray. So just to sort of juxtapose this mosaic with an earlier one, I want to show that though the mosaic of the emperor is canon technically during this time, there is no true canon. So other works we look at show a more expressive and individual treatment of the works themselves. So instead of using canon for this instance, I'm going to say the dominant aesthetic. And here's a great example of that dominant aesthetic of the time. The heads are turned to the side, the face is down, the body is flattened, with no shading, only folds in the cloth to show or represent a seated figure. Now, halos are around the heads, and there's gold surrounding the fresco. And the reason why they all look so similar is because at the time, they actually had a mathematical formula measuring everything out to create the human body in art. And this is the first time a formula is actually applied to help artists recreate the depiction of the human body. Now, moving temporarily into France, we see two sculptures next to each other. And the one on the right is from ancient Rome of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and the one on the left is the medieval sculpture of Charles the Bold, son of Charlemagne. Now, Charlemagne, if you don't know, was the first emperor of the Franks, and he declared himself successor of the Holy Roman Empire. So, challenging and changing his son Charles both took from sort of ancient Roman canon, and then we see sort of their own merging or new sort of aesthetic, the dominant aesthetic again. And we see within it, what we see that they take is the equestrian sculpture to mimic the equestrian sculptures of the past. This was to show his power and his authority as a ruler, claiming his empire as the new Rome. But unlike Marcus Aurelius, who is in the realistic, idealized canon we see from before, the medieval canon of the shortened, stubby body and enlarged head is what's portrayed in Charles's sculpture. Probably not realistic in facial features either. People would not have been able to identify him right off of the bat just from seeing his face. And everything is a lot softer, it's smoother, it's rounded in a way, it's further abstracting the body. So Charlemagne commissions a lot of art during his time, and like I said, he really embraced ancient Rome and the ancient Roman canon, and he also took on Christianity, and we see this in one of the works he commissioned of a monk to design the Bible. So monks and nuns would spend months, maybe even years, rewriting the Bible and sort of painting pieces to go with it. And Charlemagne paid for several copies of these, before the whole printing press and everything. And he did it within the Roman style. And we see this on the one on the left. Now the one on the right was commissioned from a different individual who gave the artist creative freedom. So these are depicting the same exact moment from the Bible, created at the exact same time. And the one on the right is very expressive in both the lines painted and in the facial expression. Whereas the one on the left, it's sort of like happy and frozen and reminiscent of more the early ancient Greek works, which the one on the right looks as if Matthew's in pain or in sorrow, as if when he writes, it's just this agony, very expressive. So two completely different aesthetics, and this is why I say mostly the dominant aesthetic. And here again, we see the example of that dominant aesthetic with the shortening features and the enlarged heads in a mid-relief, so this one's not quite full, and it's no longer realistic, no longer idealistic, and no longer realistically idealized. Here we have stylized work. So the Gothic period is mostly known for its architecture, but what's interesting is the sculptures built on and in these structures. We see the shift in these sort of jambs, and the two on the right are still in that Romanesque sort of canon in the drapery and posture, but the two on the left are more Gothic in style. The drapery is toned down, the bodies are less expressive, the head's no longer the emphasis of the viewer's attention. And here we see the birth of the Renaissance. So we're not in the Renaissance, but this definitely births the formula that will inspire the body for the next art movement. Giotto di Bondone, he introduced depth. He introduced shading. We can see this in the highlights in Mary's knees and in her chest. We see the dark pigments creating the folds of her gown. The steps lead up to her. We still see those gold halos, and we still see copied masses that overlap, but Mary herself and the baby Jesus are treated with a new formula. So instead of using gold to show folds in fabric, Giotto uses shading to play in the illusion of depth. Now when we look at the Madonna and Child of this time, we see these weird-looking baby Jesuses, and that's called a homunculus. And it's Latin for little man. So why did this occur? Well, they believed that Jesus was born perfectly formed and unchanged. That was kind of the philosophy of the time. So they tried to capture that sort of theory and depict him as fully grown to represent this. And this is going to drastically change once we hit the actual Renaissance.